No, business entrepreneurs. Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome to USIP, and thank you for joining us for this event that looks at the business case for peace. In 2011, we started, in partnership with the Institute for Corporate Responsibility at George Washington University, USIP convened a task force to look at ways in which the business sector could be a force multiplier in high-risk areas. Because we believe that even though a lot of the narrative seems to point to the negative aspects of business in high-risk areas, there's a lot of positive that could come out of it. Looking worldwide, we noticed that almost 3/4 of all capital inflows to high-risk and fragile countries come from the private sector, not from foreign aid. And so that suggests that the private sector could be instrumental in helping not just make profits and provide jobs, but also foster stability and peace in these countries. The task force examined a number of issues around business and peace. Firstly, we looked at the whole nexus and what business and peace mean for conflict management and peace promotion. We also took a closer look at business and realized that when we say business, we don't just mean transnational investment, but we also mean business, we also mean the domestic private sector and how the domestic private sector could be integrated into value chains that foster not just entrepreneurship, but also social stability and peace over the longer term. Since January 2011, we've had a number of meetings of the task force. We have participated in quite a number of research efforts worldwide, collaborated across the Atlantic with institutions in Europe and elsewhere that work in this space. And a lot of the conclusions and recommendations that we managed to garner over this period, we have in the two reports that form the basis of today's event. We're going to have two panels. The first panel will look at a special report on business and peace. And the panel is going to be led by Professor John Forer, one of the co-chairs of the Business and Peace Task Force. And he will be joined by Tim Fort, who is also a professor at George Washington University and a co-chair of the Business and Peace Task Force. And in addition to their contributions, we're going to also be pleased to welcome Julia Roig, who is president of Partners for Democratic Change, and it's an international institution that fosters not just democratic change, but also community empowerment, capacity building, and stability in some of the more fragile regions of the world. And the fourth member of the first panel will be Mamadou Beye, who is the Manager for Intergovernmental Affairs from Chevron. He'll be bringing the private sector perspective. And I'd just like to note that in 2006, Mamadou was the Manager for Corporate Social Responsibility for Chevron in Angola. And one of his projects was recognized by USAID and the State Department as a worldwide leader in how businesses could do things right in resource-rich, fragile environments. So we're looking forward to his contribution. So without much ado, I would ask you to join me in welcoming the first panel to the podium. And while they take the podium, let me take this opportunity to encourage you to switch off your cell phones. They interfere with the audio visuals, and they also could be a distraction to other participants and the panelists. So, John?
Are we in the right place?
Yes, you're in the right place.
Very good. You were right.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Raymond. So it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm going to quickly just introduce the panel so we can have the maximum use of the time. I'm very glad to have my colleague Tim Ford here with us joining. And we thought he would start beforehand with maybe a broader overview of the issue, kind of taking a macro view. And then we would ask Mamadou to have a more particular, maybe a little more micro of some of the examples that we have. And then Julia is going to respond with some of her thoughts on the comments. Each speaker will take about 10 minutes or so and allow you some time then afterwards to ask some questions. So with that, we'll get started. And Tim?
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for coming today. I have some personal remarks to make, but I have the closing opportunity to speak to you today, so I'll save those until later. But I'm very delighted to be here and to see all of you here as well. In the very first meeting that we had with the task force, I think the first comment that was made within about the first 2 or 3 minutes was, if we're talking about the contributions that businesses can make to peace, what kind of businesses? Are we talking about multinational corporations? Are we talking about state-owned enterprises? Are we talking about small and medium enterprises? I mean, what kind of businesses are we talking about? And I'm not sure how much detail we will get into that per se today. But there was another differentiation that is most applicable, I think, to the panel that we have up here right now. And that is those businesses that set out to do something specifically with the intent to try to construct more peaceful relationships in the country that they are working in. I think you're going to be hearing much about that from Mamadou here in just a few minutes. But I want to talk about the other kind of contribution that business can make, and that is when there's not even an intent to do it at all. And in order to explain that, you have to understand the way that I came to this writing on these topics about 12, 13 years ago. And that is that my field is business ethics, which is not necessarily your normal way of getting into a business and peace kind of a conversation, I suppose. But two things happened simultaneously. I was finishing a book with Oxford University Press on how to develop ethical corporate cultures and what were sort of the key contributions to those ethical corporate cultures. Where do they come from, and both in terms of philosophy and also neurobiological capability of human beings and things like that. But for fun, I mean, academics think of these things for fun. I was reading peace literature stuff. I think it's fun stuff to read. And I came across this material from some anthropologists that were characterizing the attributes of relatively nonviolent societies, David Fabra and Raymond Kelly in particular. And what I was struck with was how similar those attributes of nonviolent societies were to the ethical corporate cultures that I was writing about. And that was the moment that I said, I wonder if one of the impacts that being ethical in business and having an ethical corporate culture in business is that it actually might reduce the likelihood for violence. And this was right at the time that I was going up for tenure, and so I got that wonderful gift of tenure that academics get. And I said that I'd like to pursue this and see where this leads. And if it leads to nowhere, that's all right. This is a good quest to take on. And so the books that I've written, and I'm on my 4th now with Stanford, is to identify, first with a co-author, Cindy Scapani, and then independently, 3 ways that businesses can contribute to peace, whether they intend to or not. So again, some businesses may set out to try to construct peace, to have a positive impact, but I'm arguing that actually certain kinds of behaviors will have an impact on peace regardless of the specific intent of the company. Those 3 things are, first, providing economic development and the jobs that go with economic development that tend to alleviate poverty and the risks that are associated with poverty. Mind you, by the way, I'm now summarizing 3.5 books in about 4.5 minutes, and so I'm going to leave a lot of the details out, but I'm happy to fill those in if those are helpful. So that's one, economic development, rewarding your shareholders, being attentive to your shareholders, and by doing that, providing jobs and economic opportunity in the places where you're doing the business. The second is rule of law kinds of approaches. To the extent that companies are following rule of law practices, and in particular, we did an empirical study that showed a direct, perfect correlation between corruption and violence. That exactly those countries that are the most corrupt are exactly those countries that tend to resolve disputes by violence. And so when a corporation pushes on me and saying, Tim, all this business and peace stuff, we're just trying to make a buck, what can we do? My argument is that have stronger anti-bribery provisions for your organization so you can give your employee the backbone to say to someone who's soliciting a bribe, look, I'd love to give you a bribe. It'd make me a happy boy to give you a bribe, but I'll get fired if I give you a bribe. And so you provide an institutional backbone to try to alleviate or reduce the likelihood of giving bribe and corruption that goes along with that. And for several reasons, we think that that would end up contributing to peace. Similarly, to the extent that you have corporations that are promoting protection of property rights, contract rights, and almost tautologically, if there is a dispute resolution mechanism in the country, to the extent the corporations or businesses can support that, that will contribute to peace. And that is almost, like I say, a tautology, that if you've got a dispute resolution mechanism in place, then you can resolve a dispute by other means than violence. And so that kind of goes hand in hand. Then the third one is my favorite one, since, again, I'm a business ethicist, and that is the extent to which corporations have a sense of community in their work. And there are two kinds of communities that we look at. One is an external dimension, which is corporate citizenship, corporate social responsibility, to the extent to which corporations are being a good citizen. They're contributing to the local populations, to the local economy. They're being respectful of religious traditions and other ethnic traditions. They're not dumping environmental waste on a disfavored minority, which is one of the things that typically happens with environmental waste if you've got a real, intractable conflict. And so there are those CSR efforts that make sense and I think are fairly obvious, and I think that we understand them and are very important. If you look at the award for corporate excellence that the Secretary of State gives, a lot of those are based on economic development and CSR activities. I mean, those are the sort of the key things that they look at. The more interesting thing to me, though, is how the corporation constructs itself, whether it is a community in and of itself. And just to give you some highlights of the ways that that might happen, to the extent that they can promote gender equity. Lots of studies that show the more gender equity is, the less violence occurs. Well, corporations can do something in their hiring, firing, promotion kinds of practices. And I'm not saying that you're going to walk into Saudi Arabia and say that we're going to need to have 50-50 labor force of women and men. I mean, this may be a gradual thing, but that takes time. But even when you have a lopsided kind of workforce, there are still ways that you can protect women in the workforce. And so gender-related issues, voice-related issues, I want to get back to that in a second, human rights kinds of issues, to the extent that you're protecting human rights. One of my favorites that's related to voice, and of course voice is one of the benchmarks for democracy, and we all know the studies of how the specific benefits of democracy and protection of human rights. I'm just going to talk for business for a second, and then I'll wind up my remarks. There is a business strategy that has been popular in business schools and in business for several decades now that's based on a quality management approach, which is that you are going to be more efficient and you're going to be more profitable if you're producing high-quality goods and services so that you don't have to remanufacture them or get sued if there's a quality defect. Well, how do you do that? In the quality management literature, whether it's quality circles, total quality management, Six Sigma, open book management, and there's a lot of different variations of this. But they all say the same thing, and that is that you need to empower the workers to be able to speak up if they see a product defect. That's how you make sure that you end up with a quality product. Well, without creating corporate democracy, by speaking up if you see a product defect in the business process, you are equipping people with voice. And I'm challenging my empirical colleagues to try to chase down to see if there is a relation of companies that go into countries that have previously been authoritarian, that there might be a spillover effect of the political practices if people at work are experiencing this dimension of self-governance, which is what it is. It's an experience of self-governance. And whether that quality management approach, which is just a business strategy, has an impact on the political environment as well. So those are the three impacts, again, or the three contributions that business can make, even if they don't necessarily intend to contribute to peace. And if they do intend to contribute to peace, all the better. I think that's even a stronger argument for the way that businesses can make a contribution to peace. But even if they're just doing these practices, they will make a contribution. And you will note that none of the things that I have talked about are all that controversial. Making profit, follow the law, having a good corporate environment so that people are producing quality products. That's not that wild of stuff. But if businesses are promoting those and practicing those more mindfully, I think that will have a tremendous positive impact.
Great. Well, thank you, Tim. That's a lot of material to cover, right,
Yeah,
in a short amount of time.
Talk real fast there.
Talk very fast. But it does set up a nice framework of the overall kind of argument for business and peace, because sometimes it's new to people and they haven't quite heard it, and it's not always so intuitive. And sometimes we say there's a prima facie case maybe for business and peace when you think about it conceptually or through the literature, but then what do you do? What are the actions that might be taken? So it's very nice that Mamadou is here to talk about maybe a few very specific examples in which businesses have acted in that spirit.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity, and I would like to thank and congratulate the USIP for putting this subject on the table, because we believe really it is a very important discussion. My company, Chevron, we operate usually in countries that are not necessarily always at peace, or that we experience several times serious issues, serious conflict, violent conflict in region where we do operate. So I think that the subject is very important. And I would like to say here that I fully agree with the professor with the three elements, and then I would like to talk about it in terms of what, especially when I look at, I'm not American, but when I look at American businesses, particularly my own company, how we operate overseas, looking at these three elements, and I would like to really make linkages, and then and some of the things are really straightforward, and I fully agree. Now, going back to the experience that we went through in planning to make sure that we maintain peace. I'd like to take the example of Angola, when after 27 years of conflict, strong devastation in the country, more than 4 million displaced people, destruction of the infrastructure, more than a million people killed. We have been operating offshore in Cabinda for during that whole period of time. Our operations were never impacted directly by the conflict. But in 2002, when the peace agreement was signed between the two parties, our president and President Dos Santos agreed that the companies operating in the country, but also multilateral institutions and bilateral institutions, need to come together to work with the government to really quickly make sure that we can see the dividend of peace, so that people will immediately start feeling it. So we team up at that time with USAID, set up a fund. We also team up with UNDP and the World Bank to look at how can we work together to make sure in particular challenging region, so way outside of our area of operations, to see how we can reintegrate ex-combatant, refugees, and internal displaced people. So the objective there was, okay, in other regions, the experience the USAID primarily has been that we'll give them food aid, and then blankets and tents, so that they can just go back to the region, and then they can restart their life. That was all fine, but we decided that we need to go the extra mile. We need to sustain that. We need to create a sense of independence from these people and self-sustainability. So one of the things there was the USAID, through the PL 480 funds, provided the food aid, and Chevron money went to look at how the NGOs can work on providing seeds, providing tools, providing technical assistance, so that these same refugees, ex-combatants, while receiving the food aid, can also receive something that they will use to sustain themselves. So we set a metric. We introduced that business efficiency, that we told these NGOs that, one, you will have to come as a consortium. No longer we were just going to work with Africare here, care over there, save the children over there, but you all need to come as one, and then have one a business plan on how this will be implemented. And then you all have your region, but there will be one system and clear metrics. And it was 9 months of food aid, and after 9 months, all the refugees, all the beneficiaries will have to graduate from the program. And then they need to, those who want to just be farmers will continue, will get that technical assistance, and those who want to be just sellers on the street or want to do something else will need to receive that training. So our funds went to that, and then that was the first phase, and we saw that After the reintegration of around 2 million people were impacted by this program over a period of 5 years. But what was interesting that after 9 months, effectively, a lot of the people graduated. And then we went immediately to a second phase, which was to how can we sustain, how can we consolidate the gains made by moving these people out of the food aid. So for us, strategically, the important aspect was, yes, consolidating the peace process, but also moving out of aid dependency. How can these people now start looking at their farming, their lands as an opportunity, the market? People, and if you know Angolan economy, this is a country that is still importing most of their consumption. So, and before 75, this was a country that used to export everything. And because of the war, because of the landmine, because of the road situation, that whole system was destroyed. So we start investing strategically in looking at value chains. Cassava was looked at, banana was looked at, potatoes were looked at. So we start looking at value chains that will allow some of these former aid beneficiaries to start looking at entrepreneurship, to start looking at the market, the opportunities, without distorting it, because we knew that if it was just because we will fund through the NGOs a program, it will all be nice. We'll all congratulate each other at the end of the day after 5 years, and then we have achieved certain things, certain results, but the program will just collapse because the market will never be there. So we challenge the organization that you need to come up with, through the research, with a program, with the same people that you help in the first phase, with something that will allow them to sustain, to not just produce food for themselves, but to also look at the market and start basically having net income. So the program has been in place and is still working. We added to that different smaller programs around. Access to finance. So again, we looked at access to finance. How do we do that? Do we do the old way of giving money to one NGO to come and just start doing just small scale solidarity work? Or do we look at giving access to people that previously never had even a bank account? So we choose that to set up a microfinance bank, full-fledged bank that will provide all kinds of services to this segment. And most of these people were 98% never had a bank account or used the banking system previously. So our investment, and that bank was not an NGO's model. It was really a bank that was supposed to make money after a period of time. Yes, we needed to have technical assistance fund, and we received TA from USAID and IFC. But the bank's management, some of the shareholders were managing the bank, had to also make money in order to sustain the operation. So the whole concept was always how can we quickly move away from aid to sustainability and self-dependency, and also help consolidate peace at the same time. So we set up this banking access to finance, capacity building training. That was an element. We saw that the whole fabric of agriculture was destroyed. The only agrarian school in the country was completely destroyed. Actually, it turned out to be, it was the headquarters of UNIT at a certain period of time. So we then moved in with the government to just start that faculty, so that we can bring back students to train them, not just on the theory, but also on the practical aspect of farming. So link them to these farmers in the region so that they can immediately adapt some of the learning. So that was a capacity building training program was set up. But at the same time, we realized one thing, the enabling environment. And initially, we believed that that was the easiest, that governments has the right approach, that they will embrace some systemic changes in the system. Unfortunately, that was the hardest. The enabling environment, and I believe that when I look back now to that experience, is you can do a lot at the micro level, but if you don't change, you don't make a systemic reform, some of the things, your investment will not really yield all the benefit. And yes, you can consolidate the piece, but at the first bump, you may just go back. And now, in the case of Angola, they are fortunate to have enough resources to do that. Now, you take, and we can talk about that during the Q&A, Nigeria, where we experienced the same issue, violence in the Niger Delta. We recognize years of mistake that was made in the approach that companies were having. But with the systemic changes or systemic strategies we are implementing today, see how can we change our approach so that we create an environment, or we work with everybody to create an environment to sustain the peace, to sustain the current peace that we have. I will talk later on the, some of the linkages with the three elements that the professor raised, but just one point there. On the rule of law, the best thing right now, that the best element in the rule of law that the US government and that companies are adopting is, believe it or not, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. These acts really just allow us to operate and bring some of these principles to bear. I mean, you will not believe the number of times where we have to approach government, to start working with government, and got caught in the system where, yeah, would you have to make a bribe, or would you have to compromise? And the FCPA really helped us. I mean, in my dealing in Angola, I translated the FCPA. We created a pamphlet of it in Portuguese so that wherever I will have it with me, wherever I go to a meeting, I will start with these principles that you know, we operate in certain manners. And that's really just help us. Now we need to make sure we create a level playing field, that is adopted by everybody. Because it doesn't help that only Chevron, Exxon, or Freeport will apply that, but we also need to make sure that Sinopec that will also apply that. And that's and then we can talk about the other aspect of rule of law and the CSR aspect. But so I just wanted to add some of those elements.
Good, good. Thank you, Mamadou. It sounds like just a great example of the kind of things we sometimes talk about the role of business and how it can be, which has a little intentional, as Tim talked about, but also has some incidental impacts as well in doing it. So that's a great example. So Julia, do you want to have
thank you very much. And thank you very much for the invitation to comment today. Well, I'm pleased to be on this particular panel just as a voice from an international NGO, which I think we have perhaps a different perspective. Although Partners for Democratic Change is an organization that's been investing in local social entrepreneurs and local institutions to help serve as a platform for corporate, government, and local NGO kind of joint work on these types of kind of democratic change processes. You know, we firmly believe in the need to be in these conversations and to be working quite closely with both local and multinational governments. And so I would like just a couple of thoughts about, I participated on the task force, so I've been a part of these discussions, and I think from our perspective with regards to business and peace, we think a lot about the nexus between peace building and state building, and peace building and democracy building in particular. And so I think when we talk about consolidating peace, we have to think a lot about consolidating democratic institutions. And that really what we're doing is preventing future conflict. And the way that we're going to build resilience within these countries is by ensuring that there's democratic institutions that are functioning at all levels, to have a valve for when there's different interests in a country. There's business interests, there's societal interests, that have a way of negotiating through those different interests, which really do require a lot of new capacities around these, also a sense of agency, that I have a voice in what affects me, because I think that we can't be working on economic prosperity and development if we don't understand the root causes of a conflict in the first place. So yes, maybe there's a peace accord. Maybe, you know, we've had an election. But there were a lot of root causes, perhaps, around issues of social injustice and frustrations, or whatever the root cause is I think that when we're trying to consolidate peace and the role that businesses might play in consolidating that peace, we have to always keep in mind those root causes of the conflict, if it was 20 years ago, if it was 40 years ago, in these transitioning democracies for stability. And in promoting the rule of law, in addressing this key concept of corruption, I would say it's a little bit more than just the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and paying bribes. I think what we're really talking about in corruption is perhaps trying to open what was previously a closed system of elite capture, and whether it was political elite, business elite at the international and national level. These healthy, resilient systems are opening up those discussions, those policy discussions, so that you do have a level playing field, so that workers and NGOs are looking at the use of natural resources, of food security, but that the conversation isn't happening anymore at this elite level. There's systems in place to have conversations at a much broader level. And so I would say, with regards to kind of corporate citizenship, and we've been talking a lot lately about CSR as not being corporate social responsibility, we've been talking about corporate strategic responsibility. We very much believe that as a part of the citizenship role, that it does have to be very aligned with the business case. It has to have a good return on investment for whatever the corporation is doing in the country. And we firmly believe that investment should address these healthy government structures, that there's these governance aspects, so that if you're dealing with, as Chevron was dealing with local farmers or access to finance, all of these issues need to translate out to public policies, and that people have a voice in these public policies. And so when we talk to corporations about investing in good governance, sometimes that sounds a little bit politically risky, right? So that sounds like maybe I'm choosing sides and I'm getting partisan somehow. And so how do you go about investing in good governance to have this resilience in the countries where you're working? And we think that's by investment in collaborative platforms for policies. And what do I mean by that? I mean, so if at the community level, and it sounds like Chevron I know a lot of the experience of Chevron actually doing this. So when bringing NGOs together to work in a consortium, how is that consortium also having a collaborative advocacy approach to local government and national government with regards to the work that they're doing, so that it's not just implementing a particular activity, but that there's some kind of policy change, and that the local government is a part of that voice, or part of those decisions. So we firmly believe in an investment in dialogue skills, in public participation skills, in collaborative advocacy, which is building coalitions and having government at the table, which maybe we don't have a lot of experience in. And that very often corporations even have more of a convening power to make that happen, so that you're really building a cadre of local, I don't want to say peacemakers, but I really mean people who have the skills to be able to negotiate different interests, and that governments have institutions that allow for that to happen as well. So those are just a couple of thoughts that I would put on the table, and then I'll be happy to respond during the Q&A.
That's great. Thank you, Julia. And with all your experience, that's really helpful observations, and it underscores a couple points Mamadou made about not just business working, when we say business and peace, but working in collaboration, working with other groups, integrating what they're doing. And I think we'd all agree that's really hard to do. There aren't a lot of models out there about how to do it well, and we have to kind of invent it, as opposed to just business being on their own, doing something unilaterally. And your point about the need for more capacity, infrastructure in place to then support those projects that might be taking on. So that's great. Well, I would like to thank the panelists for not only sticking to their time frame, for keeping things brief, but at the same time being very interesting. So that does leave us a fair amount of time for some questions. If anyone has some, we can do that. Yes, please.
There are actually 2 microphones, if you could,
yeah.
since it's being webcast,
Oh,
so.
okay, fine, thank you.
That's good. And I should have said, if you don't mind, when you do ask your question, if you just state your name and your organization, where you're from, that would be clear.
Good morning. My name is Paulette Lee, and I'm a communications consultant. And this is. I have about 16 questions, but I know I only have one. Most recently, I was in Ghana working on a agribusiness trade promotion project among 8 West African nations. And the on-the-ground realities are actually quite different from what you are describing, because I'm hearing a lot of top-down approaches. And the on-the-ground realities are that the trade, for example, is beholden to cross-border trade, is beholden to a tremendous amount of corruption. Very often aid lines the pockets of the rulers and so forth and so on, and I'm sure you're familiar with the on-the-ground realities, and I don't want to take up everybody's time to enumerate them. But I'm wondering if any of you could address what might be some more bottom-up or locally driven approaches to what you're talking about, particularly when it comes to extractive industries. Thank you.
Julia, maybe you, with your work, you can start this point.
You know, perhaps I didn't describe what I was talking about more, because I definitely did not want to connotate a top-down approach, because I think with specifically the extractive industries, that these platforms for input about how natural resources are used, or looking at environmental impact, or how royalties are used in a community, absolutely has to be decided by the communities that are affected by that extraction. And there's a lot of very good examples of dialogue programs, of companies and governments, local governments coming together to invite community leaders to be a part of this kind of sustainable development discussion. It's very hard, and you need skills to be able to sit at that table and negotiate, and to even identify your interests. So I think I do agree with you, absolutely. There's a civic monitoring aspect that needs to be a part of those spaces, so that communities actually feel like they understand what's going on, that there's transparency. I think initiatives like the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative and EITI++, looking at kind of how the resources are used, are important multi-sector platforms. But I couldn't agree with you more. I think I'm talking about building skills at the very local level to be able to sit in those. Because sometimes it's a lot easier to forget that local government exists, because they're so hard to deal with. And it's not efficient.
Yeah, no, when you look at this issue about the bottom-up approach, or where do you design these things, and then it is critical, because if the so-called bilateral, multilaterals, and even the companies are all interested in the development and then really sustainable development, it is critical that you design these things with the local people, that they actually tell you what you want. You know, what is saddening sometimes is that to see that donors or whoever want to assist, they predetermine already what they want their money to be spent on. And then when they go out of that boundary, well, they will still insist. That's the only thing we will support, even though it's not necessarily what is needed. And then so it is critical that we design these things at the bottom up, using the bottom-up approach, but also educating and accepting that development is a process, just like democracy is a process. Things will not happen overnight. We need to work together to agree with some of these things. And then I would challenge one thing, that that companies would not necessarily like to work with the local government, or would not like to challenge the local system to improve it. Because I mean, we have experience where we will sit with government and say, like, okay, you need to have a development plan for the province or the state. Let's just use it as an example. And then we will do it. We team up with USAID to spend money on a decentralization program. We have nothing to do. I mean, people will say, what do you have to do with the decentralization? Well, you know what? In Cabinda there, it helped us. And now we're now looking at the same thing in Nigeria. Because if the government in that province can identify the population, start getting statistics right, start knowing exactly the health situation, with those information will help us, because a healthy, educated workforce is better for us. So even if you don't do it, if you don't plan it, if you do it like the professor was saying, that you do it unconsciously, it will still help. So consciously we are pushing for some of these things, because we know that a better educated, healthy workforce and population will help us at the end of the day, and also environmentally, and so on and so forth. So I think that we would like to do those things. Companies would like to invest, would like to capacitate the government, would like to capacitate the civil society, the population, so that they can even challenge the government. Because most of the time in our countries, the central government has the power. Now in Nigeria, it's supposed where the governors have the power. But we need to make sure that the population, they have the information about what is the budget and how the budget is allocated, right? And then have a voice. So we will spend resources to support those type of initiatives. But we need to do it in a manner that it's not just seen as advocacy for advocacy. It's advocacy that lead to concrete realization, concrete change that people can see and can touch.
Very good. So it's a very good question, and one that the task force continually reminded ourselves to not quite get too caught up in the stories of large corporations, although it's an important part of the story, but also of the job creation of the local entrepreneurs, and that being a part of it as well. So, yes.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rosemary Seguero. I'm the president of Hope for Tomorrow. We focus on conflict resolution and violence prevention. I'm based here in Washington, D.C., and initially I'm from Kenya. I want to thank you for your wonderful presentation, especially Mr. Mamadou. I always meet him in big events, business meetings. I'm happy he's here to talk about this, and thank you, Mr. Mamadou, for your comments. As an African based here and born and raised in Africa, when you look at what you are talking about now, peace and entrepreneurship, when it comes to businesses, when there is conflicts, violence, businesses are destroyed. So looking at where I am now, I'll be doing election observation in Kenya. Looking at the 27 election in Kenya, where many people died, many businesses were destroyed, and many people displaced. How do you look at these conditions? Looking at what you are talking about and the businesses, what would be the prevention or before the conflict or the violence erupts, so that everything, people are at peace, businesses are at peace, and everybody is at peace? Looking at what we are talking, because we are not looking at aid, we are looking at development, and we are not only looking at small development, we are trying to develop here in the US, all over the world, and in Africa. The problem is partnership. I like what Mr. Mamadou, if we don't partner, the big organizations have big money. They can't partner with the small organization. They can't reach on the ground, but we are all talking about peace here. When you go on the ground, there is nothing. When you get to the women who are like me, gender women, they have nothing. So how do we collaborate with you, big guys, companies, institutions, corporations, and make it work? That consortium, it can work so long as those who have money are working with us who don't have money, and those who have small money to care to the really people who have problems, and from the ground we can build peace. It's all about basic education and letting people and training people to understand what corruption is, what violence is, and that's the main thing. Before we get to the actual peace building, we need to educate people what is right and wrong and how peace will come in entrepreneurship and development. Thank you.
Thank you. That touches on a lot of different subjects.
Maybe we can take a second question.
Yes, of course, and then maybe the panelists can answer them in turn. I didn't see you over there.
Hi, my name is Robin Stewart, and I'm from CUSO International, which is a volunteer sending organization. And we work with businesses in two ways. One, with corporate volunteers who as a reward, corporations will sponsor their volunteers to go and work on development programs. but also we have a GDA with USAID and Accenture to contribute to economic development. So my question is for Mr. Beye. I'm curious, frankly speaking, what was the corporate strategic responsibility or the investment for Chevron in your programming in Angola? And I ask that because I think a lot of NGOs are curious how to better link with return on investment. And then, as Ms. Roig had said, this model doesn't seem to fit with your business case at Chevron. And so how can we, this also comes up because of the discussion at a meeting yesterday where USAID Bureau for Food Security head Paul Weisenfeld was there saying, we're not interested in corporate social responsibility money. We're interested in actually changing the way businesses work and finding money within the business, not your corporate social responsibility branch.
Well, thank you very much, really, for the opportunity, because it's really deserve a whole discussion on the whole meaning of CSR. At least we call it Chevron corporate responsibility. One thing that I would like to add there, that our contribution in the case of Angola, let's take the business side. The first thing when we look at our responsibility, it's not just in terms of philanthropic approach first. It has to be part of our core business. So our local content strategy, what does it say? Is that we need to identify companies and bring in our other partners. So I'm talking about the other IOCs, the other international oil companies, so Chevron, Exxon, Total, BP, and Sonangol, the national oil company, to all agree to say, okay, how can we make sure that we will identify companies within our sector, so within our business line, how can those companies start really just impact, be part of our value chain? So we approach an NGO, an American NGO, CDS, to come and set up the system. And all the companies, every year, will invest $1 million into the program to see how can we then identify the entrepreneurs, identify the opportunities within our companies, identify the Angolan entrepreneurs, identify the needs, the gap they needed in order to be part of our system, and then help them get contract with the companies. Now, I'm happy to say that last year alone, out of $2.5 billion spent, that Chevron spent in Angola, $900 million were spent on Angolan companies. Now, the overall program that was set up between, in partnership with all the oil companies on local content, there were more than $200 million after 5 years in programs that were spent with local companies. So that means $200 million being spent on local companies that otherwise would have been spent on international suppliers. So that's tremendous. And we support the local content strategies that countries, Nigeria, or Angola, or Indonesia, countries are promoting. We would like to see more local suppliers. And we will set programs to support them. And we are doing it, and we are measuring it. We have a metric, we have programs to try to engage, to bring them, to set up joint ventures. I mean, this year we brought in from Angola entrepreneurs to Houston to attend the oil and gas conference so that they can identify their partners, because sometimes they may not have the technology. And you know, let's be honest, some of these countries have just 50 years of experience in the industry, and some are just starting, Ghana for instance. So they cannot just overnight be able to start producing systems that will collapse. I mean, you have to learn from, even in the US here, Macondo, right? You don't want to see those type of mistakes. So you want, our industry is very, very technology driven and capital intensive. So we need to make sure that we invest, we set up joint ventures, we promote it so that some of our companies here can go to set up joint ventures with Nigerian, with Ghanaian, with Liberian companies and do supply us locally. And that will also help in the consolidation of peace in some of these countries, but also in increase of their own GDP. Now, a question on, so other aspect of CSR is the employment that we have a tendency to usually forget. I mean, for us, 97% of our employees in Nigeria are all Nigerians, right? In Angola, it's around 87% right now, and it's increasing. I mean, it is very costly to have an expat. I mean, I used to be an expat. I was the last expat in my department. None, zero. My job, my first task was that I need to make sure an Angolan will succeed me. And that was my success, was that to have an Angolan. And so, and that's happening across the board because it's very expensive, believe me. When you start looking at, it's in a company's best interest to really start promoting employment. And then you have the application of human rights policies, engagement of the local security forces to make sure that we train so that we improve conditions. So there are some of these things we can talk in more detail about it later if you want.
That's great, and that seems to address both aspects of some of the questions. Tim, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just in terms of trying to make CSR something that is strategic for a company and to get that message across. I make this argument in my ethics and corporate responsibility classes all the time, but I want to appeal to someone else. And that's, we work a lot, and he spoke at our task force with an investment banker from Norway by the name of Per Saxegard, who set up something called the Business for Peace Foundation. Wonderful guy, and it's interesting that an investment banker is setting up a Business for Peace Foundation. And he makes very much the economic case for business to worry about peace. And one of his key concepts is, and sometimes I think he may go a little bit too far with it, but sorry, Per, if you're listening here, but you might. But I think he's right in the sense that he says that the internet changes everything. That it used to be, and I see this in my ethics classes, until 15 years ago, I had to do a song and dance literally to get business students to think that this was a worthwhile class. But now the business students are the ones that just demand it. And the reason is that the internet can capture a corporate indiscretion and have it on YouTube in 5 seconds, just like they were able to do in Egypt with Hosni Mubarak. And corporations have to pay attention to that because their reputation and goodwill art can be broadcast in a way that was unable to be done unless you had a particularly diligent investigative reporter dogging the company. And I think it's one of the reasons that the extractives, take Shell for instance, has done a complete 180, at least in their public profile. If you look at what they were doing 20, 25 years ago in Nigeria, and now if you want to see a company that, like Chevron, is really focusing on their CSR efforts, I mean, wow, they're just all over the place. And I'm not evaluating how well they do it or how bad they do or anything like that, but it has corporations' attention, and it has their attention because there's an accountability mechanism that exists now that didn't exist 10 to 15 years ago. And I think that that is one way to get corporations' attention, that what they do and how they're perceived of what they do does indeed make a difference to their bottom line in a way that just didn't exist 2 decades ago.
Well, that's great. I think that's a good note to conclude on. And it does kind of bring up this dual issue of business involved in peace. Well, some people argue that it's a good idea and you do it because it's the right thing to do. And other people will argue that you do it because it's good business. But I suppose we really don't have to decide as long as the engagement is there and the actions are being taken. That's what really counts. So I'd like to thank our panelists, if you would join me.
Okay, thank you very much for panel 1, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Stephen Koltai and Teddy Rue.
Are you thinking of it? Yeah. Okay, great. Because I really would like to shifting.
Okay, the first panel talked a lot about businesses coming in, but a question that really engaged us during the task force meetings was, what about domestic businesses, domestic entrepreneurs? How do we engage them in a way that not only builds value and creates opportunity in those markets, but also builds peace at the same time? So we're very happy to have with us this morning to lead our discussions on entrepreneurship and peace promotion in fragile and conflict-affected countries. 3 very capable panelists. The first, would be Stephen Koltai, who is President and CEO of Koltai and Company. He's one of the leading global luminaries on the intersection between entrepreneurship and peace. He's a former senior advisor on entrepreneurship at the State Department, directly reporting to Secretary Clinton. He has a very, very rich background. You have his bio, and he would lead us by trying to help us think through a framework to understand how best to engage entrepreneurship and ensure that it is done in a manner that is peace-promoting. And after him would have Teddy Rue, who is an associate with Entrepreneurship Solutions. And their company actually goes out into the field and tries to promote entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship frameworks, policies, and structures in fragile and conflict-affected developing countries. We're very pleased to have you. And the third panelist needs no introduction, and John Fora, who is a very active member and co-chair of Business and Peace Task Force. And so without much ado, I'll invite you to go first. And I think on your chairs, you all have a copy of Stephen's schematic, and he'll be talking us through this as a framework for understanding how to engage business. Stephen, it's all yours.
Thank you, Raymond. It's great to be here. Raymond and I have become good friends and colleagues and have collaborated on a couple of things, including a peace brief that was out on the front desk that you might have seen that talks about entrepreneurship and its role in emerging markets, and particularly post-conflict states. So I am not a public policy person by background. I'm a business guy. I'm an entrepreneur. I have for many years believed in the power of entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship to significantly affect politics. And so the tagline for my work has been World Peace Through Entrepreneurship, which I really deeply believe in. I believe that the single most important ingredient in political stability, whether you are in Michigan or whether you are in Morocco, is jobs and employment. And the single biggest creator of jobs is entrepreneurship. In some cases, it is virtually the only creator of jobs. And in most places, it is the vast majority creator of jobs. And there are lots of different data sets that you can look at, both in the United States, domestically, and around the world. But the lion's share of employment, particularly in emerging market countries, is in small and medium-sized business, which are usually created by entrepreneurs. I do make a distinction between entrepreneurs and any small business. My own personal definition is that an entrepreneur is somebody with the vision to see a new product or process and the ability to make it happen. So there are two parts to that. It's a product or process innovation. It is not just another new hair salon. There has to be a difference, and the ability to actually make it happen. So the coming up with the idea is great, but does not create the business. And particularly the second half of that, the ability to make it happen, is, we know from a lot of data, highly influenceable. In other words, there are things you can do to increase the likelihood of success for people to build successful companies. Obviously, and lots of people have said this, I'd rather be lucky than smart any day, and that's true. But the fact of the matter is that you can't teach people really how to be lucky, but you can teach them basic skills to be successful entrepreneurs. So, at the beginning of the Obama administration, President Obama, I had sold my last company. I'm from Los Angeles. I had moved to a beautiful spot in Maine, which I had always dreamed of living in and where I still have my home. And I was watching TV, and I heard President Obama give his speech in Cairo. And he talked for the first time that any American president has about the power of entrepreneurship and America's unique legacy as a home of entrepreneurship and respected almost everywhere in the world as being one of the most successful entrepreneurial countries in the world. He talked about that in connection with changing the way, in that case, the United States interacts with Muslim communities around the world. And announced in that famous Cairo speech at Cairo University in June of 2009 that he was going to make the promotion of entrepreneurship, particularly in Muslim countries, a priority of his administration. Doing a number of things, starting with a global summit for entrepreneurs from Muslim countries in Washington. And I, through a variety of connections, ended up at the State Department with the responsibility to create what is now called the Global Entrepreneurship Program and to plan this first summit, which occurred in April of 2010. And at that time, Secretary Clinton announced the launch of our program, and our program was very much focused on bottoms-up, grassroots, very programmatic, non-theoretical activities to spur entrepreneurship. And I'm going to talk about those specific programs. And over the course of the next 2.5 years, we built and ran the program. We ended up with significant operations in Egypt, Indonesia, and Turkey, and smaller subsets of those programs in Lebanon, Jordan, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. And I left the State Department about a year ago, a little more than a year ago, and have continued to do exactly this same work, which is what we call entrepreneurship ecosystem building. And the central principle is that we have what we call the 6+6 model, which is what is described in the schematic that was on your seats. And the idea is that there are 6 pillars of activity and 6 categories of participants who collectively are required to work together to actually move the needle in any geography in terms of increasing entrepreneurship. And the 6 categories of activity are identify, train, connect and sustain, fund, enable public policy, and celebrate entrepreneurs. And the 6 categories of participants are corporations, foundations, universities, NGOs, investors, and government. So what we do in my firm now, and what I did at the State Department, is develop programs with partners that do one or more of these 6 things. And in each of the categories of programming, there are specific areas of activity. So to give you a few tangible examples, in the identify category, I'm a big believer in business plan competitions, and there are lots of different ways to do business plan competitions. And as with every area of programming, we've learned about, best practices, things that work better, things that work less well. So I've worked on, dozens of business plan competitions all over the country and all over the world, and have learned not only some basic principles, but also some of the best partners to work with in executing these competitions. So, for example, when I do a competition, I always make a distinction between technology and non-technology startups because they're really 2 totally different baskets. And when you're working, especially in emerging markets, and where your goal is job creation, which generally speaking is what I always am focused on, is job creation, we are interested in no-tech, low-tech, and high-tech entrepreneurs. So we're interested in helping agribusiness. We're interested in consumer products. We're interested in textiles. We're interested in tourism. So there are a whole bunch of areas that we don't always think of, because particularly as Americans, we tend to be very sort of Google, Microsoft, Intel focused, and it's all tech all the time. And the fact of the matter is that whether it's Starbucks or Whole Foods or IKEA or Tupperware, which is one of my favorite entrepreneurial companies. There are lots of aspects of entrepreneurship that have nothing to do or relatively little to do with technology. Another example of programming is I think it's extremely important to not only work with entrepreneurs, but also to make capital available to entrepreneurs. And the single largest source of capital always, always, always is in the home country by wealthy people. And so in the United States, we have developed a very robust angel investor community. I'm personally involved in several angel groups. My last company had its first round of funding provided entirely by angel groups. There are 350 accredited angel investor groups in the United States operating today that are all members of the Angel Capital Association of America. And so one of the things we try to do is not only educate and train entrepreneurs, but frankly, educate and train investors so that they begin to look at the emerging companies and founders in their own countries as investment opportunities. And that's a terribly important part. Obviously, it's a long process, but it's a terribly important part of, I think, of spurring entrepreneurship. So, you know, there are about 3 dozen different programs that we develop and have partners who develop. One last one that I'll just mention that is, I think, a little bit more innovative that we've had great success with is entrepreneurship journalism, where we bring U.S. journalists, mostly from the blogosphere, to help train local journalists in country on how to better cover their startup scene, so that we try to change the culture in a country by talking about their own entrepreneurs instead of Mark Zuckerberg. So we are very focused on finding and celebrating, which is the 6th pillar, as you saw, of the 6 categories of activity of our model. It's very important to tell the success stories of local entrepreneurs. And one thing I have found everywhere in the world, and I work domestically as well as internationally, is that entrepreneurs all over the world are the same person. Whether they are in West Virginia or Palo Alto or Alexandria, Egypt, it's the same person. They are generally speaking, and it's one of the reasons, and Raymond and I have this in common, it's one of the groups in society when you talk about peace building and finding disparate groups who actually can get along with each other. I almost always say, look at the entrepreneurs, whether they're men or women, whether they're Shiite or Sunni, whether they're Jewish or Christian, whether they are black or white. Most of the time, that doesn't matter. Most of the time, what they want to talk about is building their company. And they want to talk about who the market is. They want to talk about the logistics. They want to talk about strategic alliances. They want to talk about where you find the best people. And that is true no matter where they are in the world. And so, to me, working with entrepreneurs is not only incredibly exciting, but it is also central to making real change politically, because frankly, jobs are, in my view, the underpinning of political stability and civil society, and the creation of those jobs is what entrepreneurs are best at.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for that excellent overview. Teddy, how does this work in the field?
Well, that's very interesting. We actually do a lot of work. I guess what we do at YES Entrepreneurial Solution Partners is promoting and fostering entrepreneurial solutions for prosperity in developing countries and in fragile countries. So how does it work specifically? What I thought I'll do in talking today is share with you the story of an entrepreneur we work with in a country that you guys probably all know. Haiti, right? So when you think about Haiti, and I'm sorry, the plan for projectors, so you'll have to just try to see on my little. Yeah. So Haiti. So what do most of you think about when you think about Haiti? In all honesty. Poverty, despair. Thank you. Earthquake. All right. that's mostly what we hear when we heard about Haiti. I started getting engaged working in Haiti almost 2 years ago with the company promoting entrepreneurship there. And someone mentioned earthquake, January 12, 2010, killed almost 300,000 people. What killed the people in Haiti wasn't really the earthquake. It was the concrete and the construction. If these homes were built correctly, as per the norms we have in California, or decent norms, we would not have these casualties in Haiti. And that brings me to one entrepreneur we work with in Haiti, who's what we call an Archimedean entrepreneur, someone who is a successful self-made entrepreneur in Haiti, who decided to do something about it. So he started a successful IT company, but he thought a lot about how he could provide a safe and affordable housing to Haiti. And that gentleman is Monsieur Mathias Pierre from Kitech. So what he did, he introduced a technology to Haiti to bring safe and affordable housing to the Asian market. So talking about providing solution in fragile countries. But the business model he created goes beyond actually providing the solution. It creates job, because the way the business model works, and I'll expand on it right now and during the Q&A, is that it gets implemented through a network of franchisee. So what he did, he brought the technology in country, he introduced that new technology in Haiti, and then we started working with him very closely, ITS partners, articulating a strategic plan, raising capital from all kind of partners, local, internationals. And we raised the capital, invested the capital in a machine, in a factory that he has in Port-au-Prince, in Tabar, for those of you who are familiar with Haiti. And basically, he created a network of franchisee, over 100, 200 actually franchisees, micro-franchisees, that went through a training. You were talking about training entrepreneurs. So it didn't only create employment, it created a network of micro-entrepreneurs who are now equipped, as we talk, to pursue opportunities and create jobs on their own right. And when I was thinking, Raymond asked me to talk about what we do and how does that translate very concretely, practically. It's something that I actually like to do a lot, and I wish I could show you some videos, because I was very touched 2 months ago when the first class of Kitech entrepreneurs graduated. So those are 200 young men and women who went through an entrepreneurial business skill training over a year. We received training on a new technology. We're now equipped to build houses, not only for Kitech as a company, but so now we have the opportunity to hire these guys as employer to deliver big project that we work on, but they can also build their own market, basically. And so for those of you who don't know really the technology, this is what we're talking about, like steel frame. So it's a technology that's I'll circulate them, I'll give you all the information. It's very safe, cheaper than concrete, much safer, can be assembled much rapidly. And those are the 200 entrepreneurs that received the training. And Mamadou talked earlier about the sense in working in a fragile state and in developing countries about the independence, the sense of self-sustainability. The word that associated to that is dignity. And when we heard these young men and women talking, what really translated was the dignity. They were now equipped, they were like very proud of themselves. And so going beyond entrepreneurship, promoting entrepreneurship, and like fostering the right kind of entrepreneurs that can actually make a difference in this environment. What's interesting, I would just like to show you one of the major accomplishments of these people here. What they did, they rebuilt this school, which is the Institution du Sacré-Cœur, which is a school that collapsed in Haiti during the earthquake. 3 weeks ago, that school reopened. It's now safe and welcomes 600 students. So talking about entrepreneurship, Mathias Pierre, with a vision, making a difference, training other entrepreneurs to do these kind of things. And now Kitech is building a $1 million pipeline, providing housing solution, responding to basic needs of Asians. And Those are actually the first day of school at the Institution du Sacré-Cœur. The reason I wanted to talk to you, to this audience about this is because, and again, I wish I can explain it better, and you all could actually be there when we had, it has been quite a ride. It has been an experience working about, trying to raise capital to invest in ATs to start with. We managed eventually to raise $1 million from all kind of different partners, bringing the machinery, and then we can discuss during the Q&A, what is it to work in a country like Haiti? The point is that it's feasible. And the point when I think about, I'm actually from Côte d'Ivoire and France. I grew up in Côte d'Ivoire. When I think about entrepreneurship, I think about fragile countries, most people see risk. We see opportunities. We see opportunities not to make a difference, not only to make a financial return, but beyond this to make an impact, creating school. My own country, Côte d'Ivoire, as you probably know, has witnessed 15 years of political instability, 70% of the population below 30 years old, and a very high unemployment rate. What we would like to do now that we found a model like this that works, that's profitable, that provides jobs, that provides a solution, guess what? Housing is an issue in most countries in Africa, by the way, not only fragile states. So how could we take that model and replicate it in other fragile states we've worked or we're currently working in, from Côte d'Ivoire to Sierra Leone to Rwanda? And that's actually what we're doing, based on the vision of Mathias Pierre, so we keep the entrepreneur involved. So what we do as a company, basically, is working with this kind of entrepreneur, this Archimedean entrepreneur, and supporting them along the way through their entrepreneurial journey. What Steve mentioned is it's a great thing to have an idea, and the most important is to make it happen, actually. And those are very qualified people, people who have achieved things in their country. We just come and work with them to support them in raising the capital, in bringing the network, in bringing the strategic and advisory side to build even stronger businesses that we can then scale.
Thank you very much for that concrete example, no pun intended, on how this actually works in the field. But there's obviously a lot of challenges in terms of, getting the framework to work, ensuring that you could identify the right entrepreneur, and moreover, ensuring that the impact's not just sustainable financially and economically, but also leads to stability and peace. John, you sat on and co-chaired the Business and Peace Task Force. What are your reactions?
Well, thank you, Raymond, and thank you for the presentations. As they were talking, I was trying to think about the task force and the idea basically of business and peace and how it ties in. And in some ways, it's quite obvious. I made a few remarks, maybe in no particular order, thinking about that and how it ties to our notion of business and peace. And one is that for the entrepreneurship, it's a sense of voice, and what Tim mentioned, a chance for someone to do something on their own, to make a change. A lot of times the conflict comes in economies which we might see as more oppressive and difficult for individuals to create their own opportunities or own success. So being an entrepreneur, right, gives you a voice, it gives you hope, it gives you a chance to do something in the future on your own, not being stuck. And so that definitely ties to the notion of business and peace. But at the same time, it is risky, right, Raymond, as you mentioned, and it's even riskier post-conflict, where the conditions would be even less likely to be successful. So it made me think of how we might support that entrepreneurial activity in some of the ways you're doing by working collaboratively, by trying to bring in the different aspects. And even from the comments of Mamadou, if you start something, then and you initiate that entrepreneurial activity, but then how can you nurture it, and how can you then sustain it, and how can you build these kinds of partnerships? So maybe there's kind of that micro level activity of the entrepreneurships getting started, and maybe there's the macro activity of the larger corporations and institutions who do have the resources, but maybe we need to look at kind of that meso level of capacity that can help be a link between those two, that can provide some stabilizing role, that understands and kind of put those two together as a way of taking advantage of all the positive things that entrepreneurship can do. It also made me think of the entrepreneurship related to women and so gender issues. again, kind of related the idea of voice, but that women in many societies and having an opportunity to do things economically, personally, even psychologically, where they would not have been free to do so. And entrepreneurship, right, definitely supports in that kind of effort. And the last thing it made me think was a little bit of Tim's comments about the idea of having being a good corporate citizen, a good business citizen, externally but also internally. And it would seem that entrepreneurs, because of just who they are, and the description would be very strong supporters of having a good internal kind of community, right, where they would recognize the value of working with people just to get something done, irrespective of some past history or ethnicity. So maybe outside of the entrepreneurial world, people are fighting and there's ethnic divisions or economic divisions. But inside the business, they can't afford, right, to worry about those kinds of things. And in the business and peace discussion in literature from Tim, I think that's a real central point for business as kind of that mediating institution who doesn't really worry about the political side. They're all working together. So if people have that experience of working together and collaborating within a business environment driven by entrepreneurs, that can help start to dispel some of the conflicts or the ideas that people have about why they may not like some other group or may not like some other side if they're working with them and they're able to get along just bit by bit. Again, the kind of the spirit of business, just doing things because it's the right thing for business to do and then having a positive impact on peace. So, Milton.
Yeah, thank you, John. You mentioned the challenge of nurturing and sustaining. Stephen, could you talk to us a little bit about the 6+6 and how you see that challenge being addressed?
Well, one of the 6 pillars is connect and sustain. So connect and sustain really has, from a programmatic standpoint, really means two things. On the connect side, it means networking, and both within the community, within the entrepreneurial or the startup community and the business community. And I was very taken with the comment that Mamadou, you made about the role of multinationals in supporting local content and local suppliers. One of the most important things that any major multinational can do is buy, not just employ locally, but buy locally from as many local suppliers as possible. In some cases, even training local suppliers to meet the delivery specs that a company may require for a particular product, which on their own they don't. So enhancing the capacity to do that is one of the most important things to sustain development. We also do, and I believe very strongly in institutional capacity as well to sustain entrepreneurs, like business incubators and accelerators. And we spend a lot of time helping to start up and develop business incubators and accelerators. In the United States, there are over 1,500 business incubators who are members of the National Business Incubator Association, the NBIA. And that's probably not even half of the total number that exists. So when you look abroad, you have some very large countries. My deepest experience is in Egypt, Indonesia, and Turkey. These are countries, of enormous scale that have 1 or 2 or 3 incubators in the entire country. So there's an enormous need that still has to be filled. But I think the role of business, and when you talk about the meso level, which I think is a really important and interesting and valuable concept. So often, major corporations are looking for things they can do. My experience has always been that they are interested, but they don't always have the idea. And so if you can provide some concrete ideas, which is what we try to do in terms of building real programs, then they're more than happy to do it. And buying from local entrepreneurs, as far as I'm concerned, I always tell entrepreneurs, investors are great, but my favorite people are customers.
No, thank you very much. And you talk a lot about the need being great. Teddy, thanks for sharing that example. But in the context of Haiti, it really does sound like a drop in the ocean. To what extent do you think, would you agree with that? And to what extent do you think there is room for examples like this going to scale and really making a discernible impact in Haiti?
Well, I'm not sure I entirely agree, because I think, first of all, we have to start somewhere. We're in a country like Haiti. We have to start somewhere. We need it, these people need to rebuild their country, to build it back better, as they say. And this is what we're trying to do. And it's a matter of scale. And when you say the interesting model with, again, going back to Kitech specifically, is that franchisee model. So I'm saying, I was telling you that there's a lot of activities in the northern part of Haiti, which is becoming the new economic development corridor that it's spending a lot of attention on. They're building an industrial park industrial, industrial park. What we're doing right now, as we scale up the activities of Kitech as a company, as we invest in a new factory, we're just retraining another batch of few hundreds franchisees. So in terms of scale, I would sort of agree. I mean, it's limited. My point is we have to start somewhere. And what we're seeing is, as this business, the needs for housing, affordable housing in Haiti is huge. There are literally hundreds of thousands of safe and affordable housing solutions to be built, to be provided. What we would like to do is to train as many kids as possible to do this. And I focused on this construction venture because it's, first of all, it's one that I really like, and I've been involved working on for a very long time. But we're also working in the sanitation business. How we can provide, we're working with a sanitation entrepreneur who's trying to provide sanitation services to the base of the pyramid in Haiti. What we're doing with these guys now is, you know what, can we try to find a model where we would sort of have a similar model where we could train young people from within the communities to solve the sanitation challenge in Haiti? So the point is, by taking each big challenges from education to healthcare and finding these right sustainable business models, if we can then link them to franchisees or other sort of models that have positive externalities in terms of job creation, in terms of entrepreneurship, I think that we can start something that could eventually become very big. So that's the angle that we see here.
And we're talking about, if you have questions, there are 2 microphones. Please come up to the microphones and ask your questions. We'll take the questions in batches of maybe 4. And so maybe the first 4 would be our first initial cohort, and then we'll move on. We'll start with...
Thank you. My name is Randa Masri. I have my own company. I work on the economic development in Palestine and countries in transition in the Middle East. And thank you very much. I'm very much involved in entrepreneurship, actually. And maybe I just want to build more on the note you spoke about, because a lot of, and ask for those who are working with countries in conflict and as a source for creating jobs, and for the other panel before too, is a lot of investment now is going into entrepreneurship, whether in research, and support. Is it, and in countries in conflict area, creating jobs, practicality is number 1. Forget about all the benefits of entrepreneurship. Is the return worth the investment and that is being done? And is it really the number 1 source of creating jobs, which is really, I think, is the most important thing? And I'm talking about a region that absolutely is very important, and like anywhere else, but that region with all that's happening now is very important. So that's my question. And is there a measure that this is really the thing that international international companies should focus on in supporting these cases? Thank you.
Thank you, Rada. Sir.
Hi, I'm Chris Holshek with the Alliance for Peace Building. I'm a senior fellow there, and I spent about a quarter of a century of my time in the Army working on collaborative relationships and partnering between the military and NGO, civil society organizations, and in my later years with the so-called private sector, with businesses, business community. What I would like to hear a little bit more is an elaboration on the same sort of collaboration between the business community and civil society organizations, and leveraging a lot of their equities that we did when in the military, their relationships that they have on the ground, their very intense knowledge and understanding of the cultures there. Could you talk a little bit more about how we could kind of deepen that collaborative partnering along those lines, and not just the ones that I was familiar with when I was in the military?
Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Susanna Ware, and I am a fellow at Invest to Innovate. And what we do is connect investors with entrepreneurs in Pakistan, and we also run an accelerator there. And as organizations like ours look to expand and scale up, what countries do you think are ready for more accelerators? What sort of ecosystems are really amenable to successful social entrepreneurs in particular?
Thank you.
Yes, Mamadou Beye with Chevron. I'm just struck when I look at the diagram here about one element that I would like you to talk about, that sometimes, especially in post-conflict situation, you take most of these conflicts, unfortunately, lead to total destruction of the infrastructure. And when yesterday listening to the Minister of Finance from Liberia talking about the need to create jobs, and I listened to President Sirleaf in June this year talking about that, notwithstanding the fact that she had more than $14 billion of FDI, yet jobs are still not being created. And then when we asked a question yesterday to the minister, what is missing? Lack of electricity, lack of power, a lack of basic infrastructure. So I would like, through your practical experience worldwide, how can we talk about the need to create entrepreneurs if they just basically don't have electricity, they don't have power, they don't have the basic infrastructure? And how that can be factored in as maybe a cross-cutting theme, that whenever there is a need to help a country in a post-conflict, that you got to also create the basics in terms of infrastructure. Something that unfortunately our development agencies, not just the US, but most European development agencies don't invest anymore in infrastructure, MCC being the exception. But how can that be factored in the discussion? The second question, I'm sorry to take advantage of it, is leadership. I didn't hear the word leadership within the system. What is the importance of a country's leadership to make sure we create the right ecosystem? Just
Okay, quite a lot for the panel to handle. And there's some specific questions to you and Stephen regarding the model and its applicability. There are also questions about how this all works on the ground, the whole collaboration with civil society and the business sector. And then there was, the pop quiz, which countries are ready for accelerators. But then Radha's question to begin with, I think I'll toss your way, John. Basically, is it true that entrepreneurship and business are the #1 job creators in these areas?
Well, Mr. Koltai says so.
And is it really worth the investment? And that speaks to a lot of the conceptual questions that Tim started us off with. Is it really worth the investment, and is it #1? I think we'll probably start that way and come this way.
Well, I think to maybe try to just kind of restate the argument about the economic development in business comes back to this issue of doing things intentionally, because you think it will have some impact on society, and then business becomes a part of that and has a program, maybe like a Chevron program, and you think you're actually an accomplishing piece. And the other side is doing what businesses tend to do. So kind of the original argument took a perspective that business has a role to play in peace and it hasn't been given enough attention. It hasn't been understood, so therefore it hasn't been incorporated into the discussion of peace and peace building and reconstruction. It seems maybe as an afterthought or only as subcontractors or contractors in some process. So when you think of it that way, is the impact of jobs important? Well, whether it's important in a given conflict, I mean, I don't know and couldn't say, right? It'd be case by case. But when you think of the things and the roles that business can do in creating jobs and the recognition that those jobs generally support peace, then you would think that a policy or a kind of collaborative effort which is built around supporting an environment for business growth and entrepreneurship, for helping corporations link to other groups, to creating kind of that business environment immediately post-conflict that will help to create jobs seems like at least an immediate thing and a thing that business can do and maybe is best suited to do. So there may be that trade-off between if you're creating jobs, does it really have the impact that we want? I don't know. It's a little different by different post-conflict. But if you turn and say, what could business do that would really help the situation, the economic development component seems one that is central and one that should give more attention to business and how we can make that happen. So I'm not trying to evade the question, but I do think it's easy to try to say, here's the problems that we have, and why isn't business doing more to solve those problems? And starting from the other position, what is business in a position to do? What do they do well? Maybe some things the business hadn't thought of or may not have been willing to do before, but if it's seen in the context and collaborating to advance peace, maybe that's one more part of the actions that we can take and engaging business in a way right up front, right in kind of the policy and the reaction and the planning process of what do they have, what resources can they bring, what are they willing to do, rather than kind of having them as an afterthought once the plan is designed and developed. So I hope that answers the question.
Terry, you could talk about the collaboration.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that I understand the question clearly. When you talk about return on investment, you mean the return on investment in promoting in this entrepreneurship promotion initiatives, or actually investing? Oh, in the initiatives. From a practical, and I guess that's my personal opinion, I think from what we're seeing is, if we're talking about job creation and the potential of entrepreneurship, is the way I would look at it is, what's the alternative? I would like to know I mean, especially when you're talking about youth unemployment. You go to post-conflict fragile states. Again, going back to my own country, the education I failed people my age. They haven't been to school for the last 15 years. What can we do to provide these young men and women with opportunities? And this is why I see the potential of entrepreneurship. So I might be evading the question. I don't have the specific. Sorry.
But let me push you on that, Teddy, because the alternative might be getting government jobs, or working for, getting government jobs, focusing on the public sector and not on developing the private sector and entrepreneurship. That's the alternative. I think part of the question is it worth it to invest in entrepreneurship in a fragile environment like that, where, it's more of a risk than in a normal developing situation? Do you think it is worth it going the investment route? Probably it's a matter of timing, or so earlier on rather than later on. I don't want to put you on the spot. I'm just playing devil's advocate.
No, I would agree, to be fair. And I mean, we sincerely believe in the power of the private sector as the major driver for economic growth. So the government job might have been the way a few years ago or back then. It's just not the way it works in countries that actually do work, like the one we live in. So this was my rationale. And in terms of timing, going back to the alternative, I go to this country, I talk to people my age. What opportunities can we provide them? Exclude the job, the government, sorry, yeah. But and I think that's a very valid point. And if you take back the example that I was sharing with you earlier, the spillover effect in terms of job creation of that one gentleman, Mr. Pierre, who created 200 jobs, more to come very soon, and he didn't create employees. He created another set of entrepreneurs, and that hundreds of entrepreneurs who can then go to the field and keep on training and employ other people. So this is basically where I would see the spillover effect with a very practical example. I'm sure if that answers your question.
What about collaboration between, the question was collaboration between civil society and businesses. How do you find that working in the field?
As it relates to?
As it relates to entrepreneurship, ensuring that businesses are registered, etc.
Well, something, again, to go back to a very practical example, something that we're saying, and going back to what you're talking about, Steve, about fostering, promoting entrepreneurship, there is a need, and we collaborate with the civil society to promote successful entrepreneurs. So there is this type of collaboration that can happen. In terms of building the skills that are required. I was saying earlier that in most of this country, the education system is dysfunctional. So who do you partner with to bring the appropriate skills to these people?
Okay, thank you. A couple of direct questions to you, Steve, that you can give us a Cliff Notes version.
Yes. So my friend Rhonda, who asked this question about data, is we deal with this all the time. And in our very kind of data-driven world, the question is asked all the time, and there isn't a clear answer. There really isn't. There are notional answers, and there are places where there is deeper data available, but frankly, the countries that are in conflict or fragile states where these investments are made are usually the countries that have the worst data. So the places like the United States where you have good data, it's not as big a problem. So for the academics in the House, it is an eternal question, is how can we really quantify, particularly from a data standpoint, the return. I will say, by the way, that countries that have a very large public sector, Greece, for example, 1/5 of the workforce is employed by the state. That goes a long way, I think, to commenting on the Greek economy and the level of productivity of the Greek economy. But that's just one man's opinion. I'm kind of a private sector guy. You couldn't tell. I did want to comment on just very quickly on a couple of the other points that were mentioned. Susanna asked the question about how do we know what country is kind of ready? And it's a very important question. I have what I call the countries that are near the tipping point to go entrepreneurial. And I look at it as a clock. Countries that are between 9 o'clock and 12 o'clock are the countries that I think are most ready to go entrepreneurial. And there are a lot of data sets that we look at in making that calculation. There are about a dozen different data sets that I use myself, the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, which is spearheaded by Babson College and now has over 60 countries involved. The Global Entrepreneurship and Development Index, JEDI, which is done here at George Mason University. The Goldman Sachs 15 Emerging Markets. So there are 15 of these different data sets that we use to look at. But things like, for example, quality of universities are a key indicator, which, by the way, is why a place like Pakistan is very high on the list of countries close to the tipping point to go entrepreneurial. And Pakistan is a bit of a poster child of a place where a little bit could go a long way because they do have so many of the raw materials. Then the last thing I wanted to do was just quickly to come to Mamadou's question, which is absolutely fundamental. And there are 6 pillars in my 6+6 model. And one of those is enabling public policy. And one of the key parties is government. And the fact is that when you look at case studies, and I've done several different national case studies, Malaysia, Rwanda, and Chile are 3 countries that we wrote about in our blog series here at USIP about countries that were fragile states or post-conflict states that used entrepreneurship successfully. And we have some very hard data about what happened in Rwanda, Malaysia, and Chile, where entrepreneurship was at the center of a national economic development program. One of the things that was in common in all of these places was government leadership. And the fact of the matter is that if you look at any country, right now I'm spending an enormous amount of time in Israel. And you know, if you read Startup Nation, the story of the Israeli entrepreneurial miracle, which is probably the most extreme entrepreneurial miracle in the world, including the United States, because it all happened within about 15 years, and it's a breathtaking story. It was almost entirely led by the government initially, which, by the way, is true in the United States as well, because when you talk about the role of the military, you know, public spending in the United States on key sectors like military, like health, NIH, for example, the whole invention of the internet as a result of DARPA, these are all things that could only be funded by government. So the importance of government, number one, in having a head of state, and I hope that the president of Liberia is such a person, I hope, who recognizes the importance of entrepreneurship in driving development. It starts with that person. If you don't have that person, the chief of state, who is committed to that, move on to the next country, is my advice. So that's the first thing. And then that commitment needs to be translated into substantive, programmatic, including financial commitments to create the ecosystem. And frankly, the world is a big place. Entrepreneurship, as far as I'm concerned, needs to be developed in every country. And if you can't find countries in that 9 to 12 o'clock tipping point zone, then move to one that is. Because the fact of the matter is that you will waste your time and energy and resources if you work too hard in places that are just not ready and not interested. So I believe in picking your fights.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I'd like to squeeze just one last question. We got a tweet from Elaine in Pittsburgh, and she wants to know how prospective entrepreneurs in post-conflict countries could actually find or source the funding they need to take them to the next level. And maybe I'll toss that to you, Teddy, and to you, Stephen, since you are more practitioner-based. If they're looking for the capital, where should they go?
Yes, that's a good question, and it's one that we hear a lot in the countries where we work, where basically we see a lot of entrepreneurs who come, I mean, at different stages, very early, or people who have already built something and who are looking for financing, access for financing. Unfortunately, you were talking about the angel investor network or ecosystem that we have in the US is quasi non-existent in these countries. We have to say it. Another problem that we have is that, as you probably know, banks in these countries are very often very risk averse. So that doesn't leave a lot of option. That being said, there are a lot of programs out there. It's difficult to say because I guess we would need to know at which stage you're in the venture. What's something that we're seeing on the ground right now in the country where we work is the whole impact investing, private equity, SME boom. These people are chasing deals, and they can't find the right deals right now in Africa because companies are not structured enough. So this, but again, that depends on where you are at your stage and what needs to be done to make you investment ready to be attractive to these people. As far as it relates to startup and seed capital, I guess it will have to be country specific. It's very difficult to say like this. But I mean, we've seen in countries like Haiti, there are a couple of, you're talking about business plan competition. If you're very, very early stage, that might be an avenue that you can pursue to actually see if you can get some seed capital from this. And actually beyond the seed capital, the dollar and the technical assistance to actually take the idea to the next level.
Thanks, John. Well, and I think this is something that even you and I have chatted about in doing it, is that, you know, once the fighting is over and then you're in a post-conflict situation, it would be nice to have a little more documentation of study, or what are the first kinds of businesses that could start out. and might be started by entrepreneurs, and learn the lessons of other places, so then you have a little bit of a template. And with that in mind, then you could organize some investors who have a tolerance for that kind of risk or understand kind of that business, maybe some diaspora communities. So you've almost kind of lined up the package, so when the fighting stops, you're kind of ready to go and move ahead. Of course, each country is different and situation is different, but there are some things that can be replicated, and we probably need to do a better job of helping to tee up the actions that a lot of experience has shown that there's a high chance of success doing them in some kind of sequencing, and then bringing the investors to that so they're kind of all ready to go. So.
Just maybe one last one. It's the crowdfunding. Crowdfunding industry that's booming right now. That could be an avenue. I mean, a lot of people are willing to actually make small investment, I don't know, quasi-equity or donation into, also grants investment into very early stage ventures. And I know that this is booming in the US and that some of these websites are actually expanding worldwide, so that could be something else too.
Anything to add, Stephen?
I agree with everything he said.
Okay. No, I think it remains for me to thank both panels, also to thank all my colleagues at USIP who've worked hard to make this happen, particularly Sade Brown, who was the brains behind all the logistics and bringing it all together. Thank you all joining us in cyberspace via live webcast. But I'd like to invite Tim Fort to make some closing remarks in conclusion.
Thanks, Raymond. I will still, I think, get you out of here by 12 o'clock or maybe right afterward. When I first started to look at the issue of business impacting peace, and not just economics, there's a lot of stuff that has been talked about for centuries about the impact of economics and peace, but these particular organizations, business organizations, corporations, and the business people who run them. And I started looking at this about 1999, 2000. I couldn't find hardly anything. There was a nice manual that was written by Jane Nelson, and then Virginia Hoffler wrote a nice book of a public role for the private sector, but really there wasn't a lot of analysis on it. And so I look at this now, 2012, and there was a survey that was done by the Aspen Institute about a year and a half ago, and there are hundreds of academics that are now writing on it. We have an institution like the U.S. Institute of Peace that has run a 2-year task force comprised of former chief executive officers, generals, academics, NGO leaders. We have partners in this effort, such as the Peace Through Commerce Foundation that is founded by Whole Foods CEO John Mackey. It's run by Phyllis Belize. We have international partners like the incredible Per Saxegard in Oslo, Norway that I mentioned to you before, and a Swedish organization of business leaders. And so this is something that is starting to capture the attention. And as one former national security advisor to a president said to us when we were talking about this idea is transformative, and it's been under our noses for 200 years and we've missed it. And so I really think that this is a wonderful opportunity. It's just personally gratifying to see all the interest that has popped up around this thing that 12, 13 years ago people thought we were crazy, or failed contestants for the Miss Universe contest or something like that, talking about business and world peace and things like that, or leftover hippies or things like that. And I really think that it has grabbed the attention of a lot of people in a lot of different sectors. Second thing is, in our first conference that I co-ran with Cindy Scapani at University of Michigan, our audience said the same thing. They came from all 3 different sectors: business, government, and civil society. They all said this is a great idea, but it's really the other 2 sectors that do it. Business said that about civil society and government. Civil society said that about business and government. And government said that about business and civil society. And that taught us early on that if you're going to address this topic, it needs to be something that is very intersectoral. Otherwise, you really end up spinning your wheels. And so I'm grateful for the conversation we have today, and I think that that's going to be true in the future. Third thing that I will then lead to my very final comment is that when I started teaching in business schools 26 years ago, and this was true in businesses as well, if you had anybody that was talking about environmental responsibility of business, they were looked at some quack who was just this tree hugger, weirdo, watching Silkwood and stuff like that, that had no idea of what business was about and would never have any real world impact at all. And now you can't run into hardly any business or business school that are not trumpeting their environmental stewardship and their environmental sustainability of their product. I think that we are at the stage that the environmental movement was in business about 15, 20 years ago. People are starting to get the idea, which is great progress, but we have a long ways to go. But I do think because of collaborations like this and those partners that we have around the world, that we actually are in a great position to make this a real mainstream argument over the next 10 to 15 years. And so my going away challenge to all of you is, you came here for a reason. And I would like to invite you, heck, I want to challenge you and demand of you that you join this quest, because I think that there's a lot of work to be done by everybody with the talents and the capacity in this room. And I think that this is a really crucial thing for business to embrace and for the world to embrace, if for no other reason that business is everywhere in a way that religious organizations and civil society and government is not everywhere. Business is global, and I think that actually the business sector has one of the greatest opportunities to impact peace that there is, and I hope that all of you will join with us to make that happen. Thanks very much for coming.